We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Brandon Clark. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer here at ProCern. We'll talk a little bit about, I think most people are familiar with us, obviously, if you're invited by somebody already. We'll talk a little bit about us, and then we'll get into the kind of the meat of why everybody's here. Before we do that, David, do you want to just do a quick introduction of yourself, and we can then dive into it?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is David Stells. My background for most of my career, the last 16 years, has been in healthcare. My educational background is technology and some legal background there as well. And I've worked for insurance companies for ISIP and ISNP and CSNP plans in kind of traditional multi-location practices. So I've touched most or many kind of areas of healthcare. And HIPAA has always been, especially the security side of it, something that I'm pretty passionate about. So this is a very natural conversation for me, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thanks everybody for joining. Just real fast about us. So we are ProCern. We do a number of things, both in the healthcare space with our clients and helping with infrastructure needs, being MSP, basically all the services that go along with that, as well as my team with the dedicated security practice, not just in HIPAA, but a number of other compliance regulations and just general security, everything from pen testing to compliance audits and kind of everything in between, right? So that's kind of us. And again, if you've got any questions or anything like that, we're happy to dive in there more. But I think, again, most folks are probably at least vaguely familiar with us and who we are. So I'm going to keep going here. And just for today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk through the new HIPAA rules and regulations that are potentially coming down the pipe this year. The OCR did publish a new rule set that we'll be going over today, and kind of the crux of what we're trying to do is to educate you guys and really help you understand what it is that they're proposing, and ultimately help you form some opinions so that if you do want to submit comments or anything like that to try to see if we can help sway the OCR a little bit, then you're doing that based off some data and, again, kind of some of what we're going over here today. Specifically today, we're going to be starting with just the very broad strokes of HIPAA. Again, I'm going to try to move through these pretty quickly because I think most people are familiar with it, and really spend most of our time talking about those proposed expansions. We're going to try to highlight some of these. We're not going to go line by line. We're not going to just pull up the proposed rule and make you guys sit through it as we read each one. But we do want to try to give you some of the high points and, again, structure it in a way that gives you a framework to think through the requirements as you're moving forward with your organization. We'll talk a little bit about the way that they're changing some of the nuance of the requirements, specifically the addressable versus required, how that's proposed to go away. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the timeline, what you can be expecting over the next couple of months, and then ultimately some estimated cost of compliance. Obviously, this is not going to be, correct for everybody, but we've tried to kind of ballpark it based off of some of what we've seen in the industry. Now, before we get started and really dive in, there's a couple of things that I do want to just go over from a housekeeping perspective. One is that if you haven't already seen it, there's going to be a number of polls throughout the webinar that we're going to be flashing up on the screen and in the chat. So be sure to have that up. And then also, similarly, if you do have questions, we recommend that you go ahead and drop them in the Q&A section. Teams up at the top, you should be able to see that and be able to actually answer those, or we'll be able to answer those so they don't get buried in chat or something like that as we're going through here. All right. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and dive into it. And the first thing that we're going to talk about here is just kind of a very quick overview of what HIPAA is, kind of the two nuances with the patient privacy and security rule. David, do you want to start just by kind of giving the 50,000-foot view here, and then we can dive into some of the more detailed nuance?
Yeah, I think for anybody who's been in healthcare for almost any amount of time, you're aware of the privacy rule and the security rule. I think what we're seeing, there's a pretty tight relationship in healthcare there because it's very hard to protect PHI and PII without them having a significant amount of crossover. I think in relationship to how the the HIPAA privacy rule was updated last year, and implementation for that was, the deadline was February 7th of this year. And then with the security rule, it was, a new rule was submitted on December 27th of this past year. And I think what the OCR is doing here overall is starting to treat PII and PHI as an asset. They've taken much more of a kind of GDPR, CCPA style approach to sort of comprehensive privacy. And with the security rule, we see that they're treating PHI really as an asset to your business, wanting to know data flows and life cycles. So that's kind of the overview of what's going on currently.
Yeah. Well, and David, I think the other thing too is that as we're talking about these, right, and we're looking at these different rules, it's not just one set of requirements now. They're kind of forcing us to bounce between these two rules, right?
Yeah, there's a push and a pull for both of these, and there's a lot of tension between them, because with privacy, you're looking at getting rid of information that you don't need as quickly as possible, whereas with maintaining patient records, you're kind of having to keep it for quite a long time.
Right, right.
So there is this large period where you really have to protect this data, and you may or may not really ever realistically be able to get rid of it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's not just us, right? As organizations that are directly dealing with patient files. I mean, as we've gone through the iterations of HIPAA, right? It's kind of expanded out from just here's a doctor's office that needs to protect it, right? And I think that they've now kind of broken it out into a couple of different areas. The covered entities are probably the ones that most people think of, and the frontline patients, things like that. But there's some nuance in the business associates and the applications now that's really kind of come to the forefront as well, right?
Yeah. I think particularly for business associates is where this is going to have a lot of impact, and that essentially under this new rule, business associates are being held to similar or the same standards, which, a lot of people would say, well, they always were. But now there's a little more work to do with kind of proving that out in due diligence. So there's a increased burden there for business associates. We're anticipating that a lot of those agreements will even need to be rewritten. So there's some legal time there. And for applications, we're really talking about more technical controls, and you'll see, or we'll see, I guess, later on, that the technical controls and organizational sort of controls have been dramatically increased.
Yeah. Well, and with the way that business is these days and how interconnected so much of the healthcare system is, not just between those frontline covered entities and the business associates. To your point, I mean, I think that OCR is really trying to shift the way that they address HIPAA across the industry. It's much more about who's got access to the data, where is that, and what level of stricture they're being held to, right? As opposed to just kind of some of these more generalized requirements that they've had in the past, right?
Yeah, because really, kind of in today's healthcare ecosystem, data doesn't live in one place, and it doesn't even necessarily live, just within your hospital system or your doctor's office or your plan. There are patients using, third-party apps to access their patient data, and there's a flow there, and there's a life cycle to that. And so the OCR is taking this, and I think that's a lot of the reason that they're treating that EPHI as an asset, is that there's a life cycle to all of this. There's multiple flows. There's multiple places this data lives. And really, it's kind of gone unwrangled for a while, or there haven't been an address from the OCR about it. So everybody's been kind of going, well, we do the best we can with it, and that's that.
Right. Well, and that kind of leads us into the next topic here, which is when we start kind of wrapping up our review of HIPAA. The way that it's been enforced in the past, it's probably not going to change a ton. But with some of the controls that we're seeing and some specifically of the new proposals around showing your work, basically, the enforcement mechanisms have not necessarily shifted, but they're taking on more of a heavy burden than maybe most people have traditionally seen.
Yeah, and the OCR talks about this in some detail in this new rulemaking. They talk about their reasons for submitting the new rule, and one is technology shifts, like we've talked about, and changes. Two is breaches and data compromises, but the one that they really harp on a few times is when we do these audits, we're not seeing that people are putting these controls in. There's a lack of due diligence kind of industry wide. And so, for lack of kind of a better term right now, they're bringing the hammer down a little bit. There's
Right.
going to be a shift away from, there were historically a lot of HIPAA audits kind of happened at the desk level where, you send policies, procedures, they review them. There's going to be a shift away from that to where, there's going to be some on-site stuff. There's going to be more of that. They could do it in the past and did in some cases, but really there's a more hands-on approach coming, and they're pretty clear about it.
Yeah. Well, and that's the kind of the first thing that we've got there, right? With the examining of the reports and things like that. I mean, they're still going to be doing that and looking through that. To your point, they're going to probably put some more legwork into it, right? When it comes to some of the on-sites and some of that stuff. But that is still going to be a main area where they are enforcing this. The other one, I think that, whether it's the complaints filed both pre-breach or post-breach, I think post-breach is probably more of what we typically see when, again, we just had an announcement yesterday with Warby Parker, where the OCR basically announced that they're going to be leveling a $1.5 million fine against them, right? So that happened because of a breach, something that, started back in 2018, it looks like, and then maybe there were some follow-up breaches and things like that as part of what it factored into the OCR's thinking. But that kind of, okay, something's happened, we've done an investigation, again, whether that's an internal whistleblower or that was a breach in consumers or whatever it is. But there's definitely been a big push on that side as well, and we're seeing some of those breaches coming out.
Yeah, and the OCR was really, in that particular case, was really explicit about saying, first of all, Warby Parker didn't submit an affirmative defense. What they said didn't apply, but they basically looked at their defense and said, you guys haven't had these controls in your environment for more than 12 months. There's some level of negligence there. So they did come down, maybe not top tier, tier 4 fines, but they did hit them with some pretty significant fines given the size of the breach. It wasn't a massive breach. But that $1.5 million, it definitely hurts the bank account. The other thing I wanted to point out here, Brandon, and I'm sure we would have gotten kind of to it, is the random selection. The OCR also notes that random audits are going up. So congratulations. Your odds of being selected have just increased.
Well, and it's specifically based off industry trends too, right? I mean, when we were talking earlier, it's, especially for healthcare, insurers and things like that. I mean, there seems to be more of a focus on that, just even in rules as written with the new guidance. Yeah,
it's the OCR has said that they're following industry trends. So where they see breaches, they will put more focus. Right now, that is hospital systems is kind of the secondary, and the primary is insurance plans and group health plans.
Yeah.
So, not only are random audits going up, but random audits with a focus, potentially in your area.
Yeah, for sure.
Really makes everybody feel good. I know.
Yeah. Well, and so again, I as we wrap up kind of the review of HIPAA and kind of some of the structural changes that are being proposed as part of this rule. I mean, I think that the big things that I'm taking away from it are they're really looking at the kind of the entities themselves, who's involved, who needs to be applied to with that level of scrutiny, right? Specifically some of the business associates and things like that. But then also they're going to be ramping up some of the enforcement of it. Again, we'll see how that actually works out in practice, but it sounds like there's going to be a lot more examination, a lot more legwork, and then a lot more of kind of the random audit, being a little bit less random almost.
Yeah.
So it's kind of
reducing the pool and increasing the frequency.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely something to take into account, and that's not saying that people outside of those industries are never going to get audited. But the OCR has explicitly said that that's kind of one of the areas that they're going to be going to is those two particular areas.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add before we jump into the actual some of the controls and how they're set up here?
No, let's jump in.
Okay, awesome. So the way we've broken this down and what we're trying to do here is kind of give you all a sense of some of the immediate items. We're going to talk about some of the more strategic, maybe a little bit longer term, things that are not necessarily less important, but maybe just not going to be as directly impactful. And then ultimately some of the conditional items, things that are going to be a little bit more of a case by case basis. We're going to not, again, go through every single one of these. This is meant to be a highlight reel. But again, as we go through it, if you've got questions or if there's something specific you're looking for, feel free to drop a question in the Q&A section and we'll be sure to get to it. So David, why don't you just kind of start? I think that, the flow that you described to me a couple of days ago when we were going through some of this stuff made a lot of sense with kind of going through the whole process and helping understand why some of these controls are in place. So I'll let you just take over and and kind of run with it a little bit here.
Yeah, I would say, for this kind of slide, the first three with asset management, risk analysis, and security measure effectiveness. If you're in healthcare, you should already be doing these. So really what the OCR is bringing here is a greater level of enforcement, greater rigor, and then tacking on a few things. With asset management, the most significant kind of two things that they're tacking on is we're not just looking at assets in terms of devices. You do need to have an asset in inventory, but also a network map that shows how the life cycle of PHI. This is a very GDPR, CCPA sort of privacy move, if you will. They've kind of taken that template and applied it to PHI too and gone, okay, well, where does your data actually live? Where does it flow? Where does it touch? Because you can't protect it if you can't see it. So there's an enhancement there. There's increased rigor around it. But to some level, every organization should be familiar with this and already doing it. And the same applies to risk analysis. We're talking about enhancing risk analyses where we're not sitting around kind of discussing where our risks are just in a meeting, but we're, being required to generate a report, a written assessment, and how we're addressing them and whether we followed up on those things, which is, some organizations already do and they do it well, and there's not much change for them there. For a lot of organizations, that means enhanced coordination across the organization.
Yeah. And just to go back for 1 second on the asset management, because I think that it's an important call out that you had about needing to understand where the data is. Having worked with a number of customers on the GDPR, CCPA type of engagements and setting those up, just having that network diagram and saying, oh, here's the one box where our data is, right? That's not really what they're looking for here. The way that they've illustrated, or the way they've worded this with the illustrates the movement of ePHI, it's not just where you're storing data, it's how is it coming into the environment? Is that coming in from, direct patient data? Is that, from a business associate? Is it through an application? Where is it flowing through? Where is it stored, processed? And we saw this a lot with like PCI in particular as well, where when we were having a lot of attacks that were attacking data that was stored in memory, not necessarily stored to disk, Um, PCI came down pretty hard on that as well because people were kind of just saying, "Oh, that's not where it's stored. That's not the database. It's out of scope." And it feels like they're taking a very similar track here, where they want to see all the. If I'm able to get onto one of those machines and sniff that data out of memory, it doesn't matter that it was stored encrypted. I've already got the data before it hit the database in the first place. So
Yeah.
again, I think that's a really big call out as well. And to your point, it does follow a lot of the other industry standards that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's I think it's poignant that you kind of mentioned PCI there. High Trust, you see, kind of took a cue from PCI there as well. Um, the way I would say the way that Target and that breach changed PCI
Yeah.
is kind of the way that Change Healthcare has just changed HIPAA.
Yeah.
The rigor that is going to be required around these is I don't want to understate it at all. You know,
Yeah.
how you're ingesting the data, how it's being generated, all the way through to how we get rid of it, um, how it kind of dies or is destroyed, and the parties that are accessing it externally, what's the exposure there?
Yeah.
So that's something that'll go into the risk analysis. I do want to note something just about the security measure effectiveness and encryption, because these are areas that I would say are maybe more impactful than some of the others. Or, you know, everybody's supposed to test their security controls, and we do it sort of selectively. Um, what the OCR is talking about here is not something that traditionally healthcare organizations have had to do, and that is penetration testing and vulnerability management. Vulnerability scans are going to have to happen every 6 months, and penetration testing are going to have happen every 12 months. Um, Encryption is everyone hopefully is encrypting their patient records, but it was something that HIPAA said, you know, do it as is reasonable. You know, now it's do it unless you have a really good reason not to.
Yeah.
So the kind of light touch has shifted to a pretty heavy hand.
Yeah. Well, and even on again, going back to the Warby Parker stuff that was, again, just released, so kind of hot off the presses, right? I mean, they called out multiple times in that press release that we were looking at about the 12 months, the security testing, vulnerability management, stuff like that. And that is all, I mean, again, very directly tied into that security measure effectiveness testing. So I think that, again, it's timely in that they seem to be aligned with the message and the um, practical application, right, of some of this. And it's going to be interesting to see how they continue that throughout the coming months and years.
Yeah, I think the Warby Parker incident kind of is sort of a bellwether sign. Even though this rule hasn't been put into place, I think it shows where the OCR's head is at
Mhm.
as far as enforcement. And it's you know, it's a good example. Even though you wish it wouldn't have happened, it's a great example to look at and go, oh, this is how you're approaching this now.
Yeah. Yeah,
So their
exactly.
mentality has shifted, even if the rule hasn't really taken place, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Anything else you want to add on this? Again, I just, in the interest of time, I want to
No,
make
I
sure
think
that we
that's it
can.
for that. I think we can keep moving. I know we've got a good bit more to kind of look at.
Yeah. So the next kind of bucket that we had here, the strategic next steps, and this is one that, um, with the immediate priorities, they're kind of laying the foundation, right, for a lot of what we're looking at. Where's your data? How is it stored? How are you protecting that? Kind of from a just let's figure out what's there and go. This is more, and these items are a little bit more, okay, now that we've identified maybe where our risks are through the risk analysis, how are we deploying some of these technical controls? Where are we, documenting processes, things like that. So it's kind of the next step once we've done that foundational work. And really, I think the takeaway here for me is that it's no longer just going to be, hey, we're doing security because we're doing security. Don't worry about it, right? It's becoming much more formalized in a way that, again, traditionally HIPAA has needed to be, but now they're kind of, again, cranking it up to 11.
Yeah, yeah. And where Where HIPAA doesn't speak to something specifically, it defaults back to NIST. So documentation requirements are going to look a lot like NIST, and written information security plans with the appropriate policies, sub policies, procedures, plans, analyses of why you're doing things. There's going to be a lot more rigor around this for a lot of organizations. For group health plan sponsors, there's going to be even more of that. Technical controls, I think that's almost one that we will address in a minute here. I don't want to give too much away there, but there's significant enhancements to that, very significant. With contingency and incident planning, one of the things that the OCR points out in the rulemaking is, hey guys, really how you recover from incidents is not sufficient. Your incident response plans, your disaster recovery plans aren't really meeting the standard that they need to sufficiently protect people's data. And so that leads into kind of the backup and recovery standards. And the thing to note here is that even if your business disappears off the face of the earth, or even if your systems are all shot, there have to be separate technical controls for the recovery of that PHI and for those relevant things to bring that PHI back to life. So the rest of the business can go down. What the OCR wants to see is that you can preserve that ePHI data no matter what.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that a lot of people look at those last two, the contingency planning and the backup recovery and all that stuff. And oftentimes it kind of gets melded together, right? Because people are like, oh, well, I've got my backup, that's my incident response, or, whatever. And I think that part of what the OCR is trying to do by making these separate requirements and really kind of delineating, right, between the two is they're saying, we need you to make sure that regardless if it's a ransomware incident, if it's an insider threat, if it's, fill in the blank with, a web app that was compromised in SQL injection, we got all the data out. Like there's one plan for that, for some sort of, investigation, containment, eradication, all that. And then we have this secondary thing that is also, if it's even a non-malicious thing, right? Like if a tornado comes through and destroys a data center or something like that, how are we showing those records? How are we having that? So it's kind of we've got the forensics, we've got the incident response, and then we've also got the business continuity and some of the more operational based recovery efforts as well, right?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly kind of the line they're walking there. Is I look at contingency and incident planning and go, well, that's our incident response, and our BCP stuff, where the other looks a lot like DR, backup and DR testing is going to take on a little more rigor and, tabletop exercises, things like that.
Yeah, and I think that was the other interesting thing, right? Is that they're now mandating that you're doing some of that testing on a, defined basis where it used to be just based off your risk or whatever. Now I think it's annual, right?
Yeah, now it's annual, and kind of a you will do this.
Yeah, exactly.
Which, it doesn't sound like a huge thing, any of these individually. Well, one of them does, but but when you look at the level of organizational coordination and stuff that it takes to get through these in your average kind of healthcare organization, it's significant.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that really stands out to me on this particular set of controls, right, is it's a lot of planning. It's a lot of we need to get the documentation together. We need to get the plans together. We need to test those plans, make sure that our documentation is up to date. Which again, you kind of look at it and you say that it's weird that there's that much of a documentation requirement, right? They want us to do a bunch of paperwork. But having been through these exercises and seen when a client is breached or, when an organization is breached, those being up to date and people at least knowing where they are and how they exist really can be the difference in, mitigating something and limiting damage versus it took us a week to just figure out who's got access to the servers so that we can, isolate the network, blah, blah, right? So I think that it feels very documentation heavy, but I think the intent here really is let's look at these, let's plan, let's figure out where we are going so that when the worst case happens, we're ready for it and it's not starting from zero.
Yeah, I think kind of the one sentence OCR version of this would be, based on the rulemaking is you're going to do these things that are enhanced. We want to know that you have a plan and what it is, and then we want to know that you're carrying it out.
Yeah.
And that is bringing
Yeah.
a lot of increased rigor around these things with documentation and testing.
Yeah. And I know that we're kind of skipping over the technical controls. Again, we'll get that in just a second. David, you gave a great a teaser earlier, so I don't want to keep people in suspense too long. But we do have one more kind of slide here with some of these, and that's going to be the conditional requirements. Again, these are going to be more of organization specific, right? Hopefully, everybody's not going to be having an incident in the next 12 months. So again, if you do, though, these are some of the things that you have to be looking at when we talk about contingency notifications. This is going to be one that's going to be really interesting to see. I know that there are different standards for how long you have to notify folks based on when you are actually going to be required to based on when you're required to submit notifications both to your business associates as well as to different organizations. I almost gave away the poll question I think that Isabel had there, so I had to stop myself a little bit. But one of the things that we do have here is that it's important to realize that not only is this a government regulation, I know for us at least, we've seen a lot of these just in contracts, right? Where our customers are wanting to say, hey, if you have an incident, we need to know about it, right? And that kind of goes to the third-party supply chain. And I think it's one that, again, even just to the Target example that you talked about earlier, David, right? I mean, the start of that breach was at an HVAC company, right? So being able to understand kind of where that comes from and what that looks like with your business associates and with your third parties is obviously becoming a much bigger focus for not just HIPAA, but for other industries as well.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about that without unreasonable delay. So what is reasonable? Well, with PCI, it's 24 hours.
Yeah.
With the SEC's new rule enacted last year, it's 3 days.
Right.
And this kind of looks a lot like the encryption thing. They've gone from, hey, you need to do this at some point to, or, you should do it when reasonable to, you better have a good excuse for not doing it. It's that same sort of attitude and approach and mentality that says, you need to let people know. And I think that's going to lead to a lot of, business associate contract revisions. And where some of that legal time and effort is going to go into, okay, well, now we have to go check and make sure that in contract, as you said, we've got people telling us that they will let us know as soon as they confirm a breach, sort of thing. Yeah. Because we have to be able to respond to. Some breaches are inevitable. So really, we just want to make sure that there's a good notification system so that breach doesn't kind of spider out and become that much worse. And then, I'm sorry, group health plan people. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, and I think just to piggyback off that, and one thing you mentioned earlier with the business associate agreements, those are going to be one of the big areas that this one in particular comes into place, as you just mentioned. So as people are looking at those, that is a big one, because I know that traditionally that can be a sticking point because people are a little bit hesitant to share when they've been breached, especially with kind of the HIPAA wall of shame and all that stuff that goes on. So again, I think that's something that as you're negotiating those business agreements, it's very important to make sure that language is in there so that you are protecting yourself and setting those expectations with your associates.
Yeah.
So
for this next one, I do want to just take a minute on this because this is buried in this one sentence is a lot of sort of requirements. So when you go and read that new rule for group health plan responsibility, there's an enhanced accountability for plan sponsors, and that group health plans are going to have to explicitly document their security and privacy obligations within their official plan documents, which will hold them accountable for securing PHI. Plan documents are going to have to outline the security measures that sponsors have to implement, and that can include things like access controls, encryption, all of an administrative sort of safeguards. Obviously, that means aligning with the security rules updated requirements, which will mean some different workforce training, different risk assessments, breach plans. And then plan sponsors are going to have their plan documents are going to have to reflect some clear guidelines on when and how sponsors can access PHI. So some of this you may already be doing, but a lot of it is new or enhanced. And for those in those situations, this is probably not a very pleasant slide.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for everybody, I think the next one's even more unpleasant in a lot of ways. So
yeah. Audits. We all love them, right? So this doesn't look like internal audit. This is my reading of this looks like external audits where you have someone come in and you don't get to grade your own homework anymore. You need to review your homework, but someone else is going to be grading your homework to ensure compliance with the security rule. So this looks like external testing. Pen testing is going to be part of that. Vulnerability management or vulnerability scanning is going to be a part of that. But also, actually coming through and testing those security rule controls from a third party.
And I want to be clear here, because when we say external audits, that can scare a lot of people. What the current rule appears to be, and again, we're very early in the process, and this is partially why it's important, if you are concerned about this, to go and leave comments for the OCR. What it appears to be is not going to be like you have to go get a HIPAA certification, right? Like you have to go through a PCI audit with a QSA or something like that. It rather appears to be, you need to have somebody come look at it. Again, to David's points that you're not grading your own homework, but they're not really establishing a direct stamp of approval, right? At least that's the way, again, that I'm reading it, David. I don't know if you got a different interpretation, but it feels more like you just need to have somebody come in and look at it, not necessarily that you have to, again, get that formal stamp, formal audit. So there may still be some flexibility, more so than, again, like a PCI audit, but
yeah,
they are removing a lot of that kind of self-governance, if you will.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point, I think, here, Brandon, is that they're removing that self-governance. They're not saying, hey, you need a high trust certified organization to come through, or a QSA, but you need someone else to look at these. And really that makes sense, because in the context of NIST, and where HIPAA kind of defaults back to where it doesn't speak to something specifically, implementing a NIST control it's an open framework. It's something that is more about familiarity and testing and the rigor around it than having a stamp or a seal of approval.
Yeah. Well, I am very glad that you mentioned NIST, because to the teasers that you've been putting out recently, I think that it's time for the big reveal. Yep. And that is that one of the biggest changes in this entire thing, when we talked about technical controls, when we talked about the structure of it, they've really basically removed a lot of the flexibility by changing the way that they're going to look at addressable versus required. David, I'm going to let you touch on this one, because you've got a lot more of the experience on it. But I mean, it's a pretty massive change.
almost don't know what I can say that the slide doesn't.
Yeah.
But it's exactly that. There were 174 controls before, and when you read through the OCR's proposed rulemaking, they want the whole thing included, which takes us to 805 controls. Now, some of those controls, that's super scary, and maybe we can contextualize this a little bit for you. Um, some of those controls are, hey, do you do a risk assessment? And you can check the box and hit yes. Well, it has to be enhanced risk assessment, written under this new rule. But some of them are kind of as easy as that. Others are highly technical controls, and there are a few hundred of those.
Yeah.
So it's not all sunshine and butterflies, and it's not all madness and tornadoes and the end of the world either. There's a mix there in that 805, but the overall point is that before you could evaluate whether these things, encryption was one of them, reasonable and appropriate. Now it's do it.
Yeah.
um,
Well, and
and
go ahead.
I
I'm
think
sorry.
there will be different timelines for different sets of these controls, and the OCR does lay that out. So it's not do it tomorrow. I think it's going to be, they say they're going to set some defined timelines for implementing each of these things, almost like milestones.
Right. Well, and that's again, not to keep harping on PCI, but we just saw that with 4.0, where they said 4.0 is applicable as of March of 2024. But then there are, 60 or 70 controls, whatever it ended up being, that were future dating to March of 2025, right? So it's very possible that they do something like that, or they could even go to almost like the CMMC model where, you're a level 1, level 2, level 3, right, with different levels of requirements. They just haven't really given a whole lot of context on what they're thinking at this point. So to David's point, the 805, it definitely does seem scary. It might be very scary. We're not sure yet. A lot of it's going to come down to how they finalize that final rule, which is probably not the most eloquent way to say that, but there's still some time here. And again, we'll talk in just a second about the timeline and kind of what to expect. But I think the hope that I have is that they don't take this kind of sledgehammer approach, and they do, whether it's with milestones or something else, they do allow folks to kind of use a little bit of common sense as opposed to just hitting you with this giant bucket of things that you have to do now.
Yeah. I think we'll see progressive sort of timelines for a lot of this.
Yeah.
Because why mention it if that's not your plan? Why talk about it? So
Right.
what that timeline looks like is unclear. It's something that will be published with the final rule, supposedly. So
Right.
we'll find out March 7th.
Yeah.
But I would encourage people, if you're looking at this and your jaw is on the floor like mine was when I first read it, go leave a comment.
Yeah.
Go let them know that some of this is pretty burdensome.
Yeah. Well, and that takes us into the comment period and kind of the timeline for how this works, right? So because of the requirements for how these types of rules have to be proposed, when they set it up December 7th, or I'm sorry, December 27th, they basically had about 60 days to go through and collect comments. So that's where we are right now. That period should close March 7th. Sometimes they'll extend it, but at the very least, it should run through the 7th. So as you're looking through this and as you're looking, not just with this webinar, but also if you're doing other research or anything like that, then be sure to go through, kind of compile your thoughts, and you can go and leave comments for the OCR. And hopefully, if enough people are doing that, they'll see, maybe, hey, we need to make some changes and tweaks here. They will then typically take about 60 days, and the final rule publication will follow after that. What that means is that in this case, again, if they stick with a timeline, we're probably looking early May, probably around May 6th. But at a minimum, it would be about 60 days. After that, we have a mandatory 180-day waiting period, so a 6-month waiting period before the rule can take effect. So at the earliest, We're talking about basically December of this year, where these changes could be into effect. However, it's more likely that again they're going to give us around 7 to 12 months when they start actually putting this into place. Again, to David's point, this will all be outlined in the final rule publication. But again, worst case scenario, we could be looking at December of this year. If not, it could be a little bit longer. Hopefully, it's a little bit longer just because of some of the changes that they're recommending or they're requiring, I guess. But this is kind of what you can expect from a compliance and timeline perspective. So we do have a little bit of time. But again, if you guys are concerned about this at all, highly recommend that you go in and leave comments there. And if you need help with that, our team is willing to help kind of point you in the right direction and help, think through some of that as well.
And one of the things I want to point out about comments is that they are all over the board. There is everything from, hey, this stinks, to even providers and, doctors saying this needed to happen way earlier. To, hey, this is going to cost me a ton of money.
Yeah.
So whatever it is you have to say, feel free to say it in the comments.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of takes us to that cost of compliance, and OCR has published some data on what they think this is going to take, very helpfully, as all government regulations and entities do. They decided to put this in terms of kind of the industry as opposed to individuals. So what we've tried to do is kind of take this and break it down into some of the things that we've seen across customers and what to expect. I'm not going to go through each of these individually, but you can kind of see some of the main areas that they've called out, things like policies and procedures, pen testing, revising the BAAs. That's going to require you to, go get a lawyer and probably spend some money with them. So overall, as we start looking at this, we've kind of ballparked it based off of an organization that's probably got about 160 individuals. You're probably still looking at a pretty significant investment, a little south of six figures there. Obviously, these numbers will change based off of your situation, where you are in that compliance journey. But again, this is kind of what we're expecting and seeing just based off of kind of our experience with the healthcare industry as a whole.
Yeah, and something I want to note here, Brandon, is that I think the OCR got this wrong. Don't want to get struck by lightning or an audit here, but
right.
But I think this is an area that they got wrong, because when you read their calculations and read through those, they essentially say, hey, most organizations should already have MFA deployed through their entire environment. Experience teaches me that's probably not true. When they look at network segmentation, they say, hey, this should only take you about 5 hours. If you only have, 2 VLANs or 2 subnets, maybe.
Yeah.
But that's especially in medium-sized to larger networks. And we've seen, just in practice, we've seen organizations that have hundreds of VLANs or, dozens and even hundreds of subnets. That's not 5 hours. That's, 4 to 6 months.
Yeah. It's definitely I think taking a little bit of rose-colored glasses to some of these things, but I think it's also part of I don't want to say a scare tactic, right? But I think that they're trying to make it whatever the opposite of a scare tactic is, right? They're trying to make it not seem as bad so that maybe there's not as much pushback or something like that. I don't know. But yeah, I definitely agree that there's something a little fishy with some of those estimates that they put together.
Yeah, and you see it in the comments where one person has, I think, meaningfully said, hey, this is going to cost my organization 50 times what you're estimating in some areas. Oh gosh.
Yeah.
So, I think they want to paint this as though it's not going to be as burdensome as it truly is going to be. So I think these numbers are low, but it may not be, they may not be horrible if your organization is already in pretty good shape.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is also where, again, just to highlight and maybe talk about the next slide here a little bit, this is why it's so important to start early, right? It's important to look through, understand, kind of some of the foundational work that we're talking about here, because if you can define that, then that will help guide a lot of these future conversations, right? If you need to start network segmentation, maybe you got to pull that in and start doing that, tomorrow, right? Because it's going to take you 18 months because you've got thousands of VLANs, right? Those types of conversations need to be happening, even if the final rule gets neutered way down. A lot of these things are still probably going to be coming into effect. So it's worth at least having the conversation with the internal teams to say, hey, if we had to look at doing some of this stuff, what would it take? Right.
Yeah.
Because again, I think for a lot of our clients and, just the way that we've been interacting with other folks and talking with folks, a lot of them are saying it's going to be more of a 12 to 18 month type of timeline. And again, this is kind of something that we've tried to ballpark and average out. So it may be shorter, maybe longer, depending on the size of the organization, the sophistication, all that. But definitely something I think that we need to just kind of put on people's radar, because that deadline is going to come up sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and a couple of things I want to highlight here are, if I'm in the position of, a director of information technology or similar in a healthcare organization, I would encourage everybody who's in compliance positions or IT, IS sort of positions, start having those conversations with your leadership early. Figuring out where the organization is at. One of the things that we hear frequently is, our team is small, our team is kind of bare bones. So sometimes that work does have to be distributed over a longer period of time, or, you need a hand or something. But start having those conversations early and evaluating where you are early, because this is something that I think the OCR is probably not going to take lightly if they see that things aren't done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really encourage everybody to try and stay ahead of this.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I know we've only got about 5 minutes here. I do want to open it up if there are any questions. I haven't seen any in the chat or in the Q&A section, but just if you guys have anything, please go ahead and put that in there. While you're doing that, I just want to say thank you again to everybody for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are in the country. It's always a pleasure to talk to everybody and kind of help talk through some of this. Again, I'll reiterate, if you've got questions after the fact, we are going to have the recording. We're also going to be sending everybody kind of a checklist of some of the things that we've seen. And hopefully, again, that helps guide some of those conversations and have some of those get started. If you do have questions, you're welcome to reach out to us directly, or again, if you've already got a relationship with one of our other team members, they can help direct you to either David or I. We'll be happy to jump on and help at all there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Isabel, Rachel, I don't know if we've got any questions. I don't see any of the comments. I don't know if I'm just not able to see them or if there's anything else.
Yeah, I just saw one in the Q&A, but it looks like Isabel fielded that one, so thank you.
Okay.
There's a few more typing, so
Okay, cool.
pretty much everyone's saying great information. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Okay. Well, yeah, our pleasure, and thanks again for joining. Yeah, and like I said, if you want the recordings or the slides or anything like that, please just reach out, and we'll be happy to share those. So let us know if there's anything else that does come up. All right. Well, awesome. We'll let everybody get back to your Friday. Hope you all have a great and safe weekend. If you're in the Denver area, be careful shoveling snow or driving around on the roads. But hopefully for some of the other folks, I think there's some in Tampa and other places. Hopefully everybody's warm and safe and has a great weekend. So.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time. And like I said, any questions, please reach out to Brandon or I.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great one.